You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm joined by Alex Partridge, a French instructor and content creator based in Paris. He's here to discuss a phrase that translates to guilty pleasure. But make no mistake, the French feel no guilt when it comes to this pleasure. Péché Mignon. All right, welcome, Alex, to the podcast. Alex, could you let our listeners know a little bit about you and what you do here in France?
Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Partridge. I am a French teacher and content creator on Instagram. I do lots of videos dissecting sentences, expressions. I put a lot of comedy in as well. So yeah, I'm a big Francophile. I started learning French when I was 12. And I'm 30 now. So it's just my lifelong passion is sharing the French language with other people.
That's awesome. And, I think our viewers, with the interest in language they have are probably going to really love checking out your Instagram, checking out your, the ways in which you sort of explore the ins and outs of French language and French culture, which is our mission over here on Navigating the French. And when I reached out to you, you highlighted a couple of different words and expressions that sort of evoke the depths and the breadths of what make the French so unique. And one of the things that you highlighted was an expression that I absolutely love, which is péché mignon. So péché mignon, I think, is one of those expressions that has like a direct translation and, also a bunch of connotations. So if you were just directly translating péché mignon into English, what would the direct translation be?
Word for word, cute sin.
Cute sin. Okay.
Literally, the literal translation. But what it captures is it's a guilty pleasure, an indulgence.
Awesome. And I think, it's one of those expressions where the direct translation tells us a little bit about how we kind of perceive of it in French. So there's that sort of like cute side. There's the sinning side. So we have that little bit of guilt built into the expression, and I'm excited to unpack it with you. So when you think about a péché mignon in French, do you think that it usually refers to something like a food that you feel bad about loving, or like a habit that you don't want all your friends to know that you partake in? What's sort of the first thing that comes to mind when you think of péché mignon?
Well, first of all, let's put ourselves into the place of your typical, I'm not speaking for all French people, but French people at large, there's no feeling bad about having a péché mignon. It's more so, it's more just a playful way to say that it's a little indulgence of yours. And usually when someone says that something's their péché mignon, they say it with a little smile. It's always pretty playful. And it usually involves food or drink. It could, I've heard native speakers use it for an occasional cigarette. But it's definitely more of a term that's used for food. Yeah, definitely food.
Okay, cool. So would a péché mignon then be something that you kind of know is bad for you, or something that, I think a lot of French people feel bad when they like something that isn't French. And by that, I mean when it's something that's American. So would a péché mignon be like your McDonald's habit? Would it be, the fact that you like to have two croissants in the morning? What is it sort of most often for you?
It's most often just something that is typically, it's bad for you if you have too much of it, if you don't eat within reason, a reasonable amount. So if you're having it several times a week, then it becomes a problem. Like a pastry, just something sweet, something that might be heavy that you can't eat all the time. And it's a guilt. There isn't guilt involved because this isn't coming from an Anglophone context. It's just a cute sin. It's a playful. It's something you're not ashamed of. You're not ashamed of it. You're happy to indulge in it, but deep down that you can't do it every day.
Yeah. And I think that's actually something that's really important to delve deeper into in terms of the French culture. When I'm not doing this podcast, I'm also a a culinary journalist and a food tour guide. And one of the most frequent questions I get, and I'm sure you get this all the time, is, oh, how do the French eat all this pastry and cheese and everything without being, overweight or having crazy, heart problems or just, whatever kind of associations that we as Americans, as Anglophones, associate with kind of rich, indulgent food. But you've kind of hit the nail on the head there in terms of the moderation side. And I feel like that's kind of baked into the French notion of these richer foods like viennoiserie, which most French people tend to have maybe at the weekends, but not every single morning. So are there ways that, in your time in France, that you've noticed that the French kind of relationship to foods that would be thought of as a péché mignon, as a guilty pleasure, they don't feel bad every time they eat a piece of chocolate, right? Sort of what's the approach, the mental approach that you've noticed most often with French people towards these sort of péché mignon foods?
There's an expression I also love, c'est de la gourmandise. And sometimes I have friends who say this if they're about to bite into something, maybe, very rich, very heavy, lots of cream everywhere. And you say, c'est de la gourmandise with a little smile. And it just means that's one that is definitely hard to translate. It's wordier in English, la gourmandise. Well, technically, la gourmandise is one of the 7 deadly sins.
Uh-huh.
But the French have turned it into something to be proud of. It's just like, so la gourmandise has a positive connotation. It's just like it's the love of good food. That's how you'd have to translate it into English. La goinfrerie would be really the gluttony. The goinfrerie, that does not have ever a positive connotation. You would use it maybe jokingly, saying, wow, like you are just going all out, this is terrible. Gourmandise has a positive, playful connotation. And, if you're indulging in something, you might say, c'est de la gourmandise, c'est mon péché mignon. I'm going to eat this unapologetically. By the way, there is no word for unapologetic in French because the French do not apologize for enjoying good food, and there's much less guilt involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my God, you've kind of cracked this relationship towards food that the French have, which I love so much. With gourmandise as well, like I think I've noticed people, when they say, oh, I've eaten enough, but I'm going to have a tiny bit more juste par gourmandise. Like, you've had a first slice of cake and you're like, ooh, I don't need any more, mais par gourmandise. Like, and you're right. It's always with this kind of playful smile. And there's no, for as much as you said, gourmandise is one of the 7 deadly sins. Péché means to sin. There's none of this like self-flagellation afterwards. There's none of this like the next day after a party, the French aren't like, oh my God, I was so bad yesterday. Not at all.
Not at all. The exact opposite.
Yeah.
Wow, I'm so glad we lived life to the full. And it's the complete opposite. But there's also, the French have this way of, in some ways it can be very annoying because everything needs to be in a cadre. Like there's a certain time and a place to do everything, and sometimes it gets to be a bit much. And that's with bureaucracy, that's with eating habits. But what I appreciate is that when you're at the right time and place, you can really be happy and guilt-free when you're biting into your cake or whatever you're enjoying, and there isn't this calorie counting or self-flagellation.
Yeah. So when then is, with these rules and regulations, when is the wrong time and place?
Well, typically in the morning. I mean, this is unofficial because in the morning you're allowed to have breakfast, but typically, I'm half English, half American, so I love my big breakfast with the ham and the eggs and everything. And for French people, typically, they might just give you a look and say, "Oh, like that's a bit much, isn't it? It's a bit heavy. It's kind of écœurant. It's a bit kind of almost disgusting to think to consume that much soon after you wake up." So you get a little maybe look of disapproval, but ça passe. Maybe that's fine because it's still breakfast. But really, the wrong time and place would be just some random hour. Just 1 p.m., you had lunch an hour ago, and then you're just snacking on something. You would have to have it during the goûter. You'd have to have it around 4 p.m., maybe a little pâtisserie, maybe a little pastry at that time. That specific little window is when you can have your gourmandise, when you can have your allocated snack time. They're pretty strict about when you're supposed to eat. You can't just snack randomly. And sometimes when I'm with like family or friends in the US, sometimes I'll be a little shocked. But I forget that years ago I did the same thing, where someone just takes out some fig Newtons or starts eating something really out of nowhere at a time that doesn't seem appropriate to my mind anymore. And I think, oh my goodness, what are they doing? That is just ça va pas.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, it's just random snack time, just out of nowhere is when there actually is the péché mignon is not mignon anymore. It is just a péché.
Yes, 1,000%. Yes, and that's one thing that I noticed was I was raised in a household where we snacked on a lot of fruit. And so, living in France, we do kind of break our days into, breakfast, as you said, which is like small and sweet. And, like the full English, which is like one of my péché mignon is absolutely kind of not on the menu. And then you have your lunch, and then you have your 4 o'clock goûter, and then you have your dinner. And I remember once when I was living with French roommates, taking an apple out of my bag at like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And my roommate looked over at me with this look of horror and was like, "Did you miss lunch?" And I was like, no, I had lunch. I'm just having an apple. And they're like, oh, that's so weird. Like to have this like snacking or eating outside of the kind of designated eating times.
Mm-hmm.
Or even to eat things out of order. Like, you have your appetizer, your main, your cheese, and then your dessert. And if you go back to cheese after dessert, or you go back to your appetizer during your cheese course, people think that's a lot more punishable than just indulging in a little gourmandise, a petit plaisir.
Oh, I know. And sometimes I like to do cheese tasting. Maybe this is very maybe Anglo-Saxon, but I love to do a little cheese tasting with wine on an empty stomach. So so I'm hungry, so I can enjoy the cheese. No, I don't want to have a cheese tasting after I'm full. So to me, it doesn't seem to make as much sense.
No, I would agree with you. And I think, the English side of you puts cheese and port after dessert, which is a whole other thing that I don't know what the French would know, if they would know what to do with that. But so it's more about when and maybe how, because I think the French tend not to really eat on the go. Like they don't pull food out of their bag and eat it kind of in between. Like they'll sit down and really have a ceremony.
Absolutely not. Yeah. And I used to live in New York City for 7 years, and I remember the number of times I'd walk down the street with a bagel or a wrap or something and eat while I'm walking. And now that is just unfathomable. Just unfathomable. I would start to feel queasy, I think, if I did that. And I mean, it makes sense. Why are you, having a meal while you're rushing down the street? It's just odd.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, I think a lot of people would love to believe, we have these mystical things that we attribute to the French, and specifically to French women, but I think to the French in general, about how they're able to eat all this rich food and they don't ever gain weight and blah, blah, blah. But I do think that the French have a really unique relationship to sort of diet culture as compared to Anglophones. Have you encountered that at all? Like, do the French embrace diets and cleanses and calorie counting and anything like that, or are they completely immune to all of these sorts of health crazes?
I never hear that vocabulary in Paris, but maybe I'm not with the right people. I don't know. To me, that's something I like a lot more about life in France, is that because there are these kind of these norms put into place where you eat at this certain time and you don't eat way too much and the quality is higher. I feel like you don't have to backtrack with all these diets because people are just staying at a reasonable weight in the first place.
And I think you do notice French people, like you brought up a word earlier that I wanted to circle back to because I think it's really important and people say it a lot, which is écœurant, which like it's a reference to the heart, but it's kind of like nausea or like overwhelm in richness. And they talk about that a lot more. And so what context would you hear that word in?
Yeah, like I hear that for when something is overly sweet, like there was too much sugar put into a tarte or something, and someone might say, oh, c'est écœurant, c'est écœurant. It's so sweet, it's disgusting. Or if something has added sugars, if something tastes like it was made in a factory, a French person will say, oh, c'est écœurant. Mm-hmm. So heavy, overly sweet, to the point where it's nauseating.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Storytime in Paris, where each week host Jennifer interviews a different author about his or her book set in Paris or France. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. I think this thing that people are trying to get Americans to do, I mean, that mindful eating coaches are trying to get Americans to do, which is to really listen to their body. I mean, the French do that really naturally by talking about like, oh, it's so sweet or so rich that it's making me feel, I can feel it in my stomach. Or they'll say like, oh, they talk consistently about their digestion. And they'll say things like, I'm having a hard time digesting this, or c'est pas digeste. It's not like easily digestible.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like, whereas maybe in the past, this is changing now in the US, which is nice. People would focus so much on how foods made them look, how eating too much made them look or fit into their clothes. I feel like the French really naturally kind of lean into how eating or not eating a certain thing makes them feel sort of physically. Do you get that sense?
That's an excellent point. Yes. And then as a result, they look healthier. They're at a more reasonable, healthy weight because of that reflection, because of it taking more time as they're putting things into their body. So it's not a direct, oh, I need to do that to look this way. I need to, it's not like I need to have this many calories. I need to eat this too, so I can look thin. It's this whole process that has a result that a lot of other cultures are trying to imitate.
I would totally agree with you. And then, I mean, because we're using this word sin, but there is no real guilt built into it. I mean, they're kind of self-correcting, if they have a crazy Saturday night and they drink a lot of wine and they eat, one too many gougères and then maybe the next day they'll say, oh, I feel like I need something a little more digest today just to kind of balance it out. And it happens naturally without them necessarily needing to count macros or count calories or, and this is obviously all generalization, but it just feels culturally like that's how they talk about food and that's how they relate with their food.
Definitely.
And so the other side to that, of course, is that I think the French seem to have an easier time leaning into sort of pleasure for pleasure's sake, rather than feeling like, oh, I'm going to let myself be bad or, having this kind of self-judgment already baked into their enjoyment of something. Do you think that we can see that sort of French desire for an appreciation of pleasure in this way or in other ways maybe that you've witnessed regularly in your time here?
Well, definitely when it comes to taking time off, I mean, the 6-week vacation. And again, like when I used to work in a newsroom in New York and I fought to get 12 days or something, less than 2 weeks. And it took a lot of pulling strings to get that extended vacation. And when I came back, everyone thought I had quit. They said, oh, we thought you quit. You've been gone for so long. And I had to like tone it down and just fit in with everyone. And in France, if I had taken that amount of time, people would have said, oh, you should have taken more, profite. So it's always about profite de ton repas, de tes vacances. It's always, so just leaning into, I don't know if I'm answering your question though.
No, I think you are. Yeah, leaning into pleasure and absolutely. It feels like such a French, I mean, and it's pervasive. It's not just for your viennoiserie. It's not just for your péché mignon. It's something that's pervasive.
And there's a lot of ways, like when I notice when I'm sitting around a table, we're, eating something, we're tasting something, and they'll say, oh, ça se mange sans faim, or ça se mange tout seul, ça se mange sans appétit. It just, there's all these ways, and it's hard to translate, ça se mange tout seul, but just like, you can just eat it without, it's just wonderful. Like you can just eat it without being hungry, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with eating something even if you're not hungry, because it's delicious and we're enjoying life.
Yeah, and I think that lack of guilt means that they eat for as long as it's pleasurable, and when it's no longer pleasurable, they stop very naturally without feeling like, oh, well, I've already been bad, so I might as well finish the whole pizza.
Exactly. Yes. Oh, yes. That is, quite different way to look at it.
So do you have a péché mignon here in France?
Oh, I have a lot of péché mignon.
What's your favorite?
I love the salamo.
Ooh, what's that?
Well, it's often called the gland. I think it's called that in the South more often. It's not very elegant because it has another meaning with the male anatomy.
Uh-huh.
It's called salambo. It's it's filled with crème pâtissière. It's pretty heavy, but it is delicious. And my English Anglophone background was on the verge of saying, but it's worth the calories. Because it is. It's really, really good. It's rich and it's so good.
It's kind of like a really fat eclair, right?
Yeah. Oh, it's so good. What else? Chouquette. Okay, there's different chou and chouquette. So chouquette, I am obsessed with. I did a video at my favorite bakery who does the best chouquettes in Paris. Chouquettes are really hard to master, I've noticed, because I've gone on like a chouquette tour, and it's hard to find them done the perfect way. But chouquettes are just it's like this little cloud, this puff of heaven. And it's hollow on the inside, and it has these crunchy little sugar pieces on the outside. And so yeah, chouquette is another péché mignon. And what else? Oh, at the end of summer, fresh figs on a delicious baguette with some rocamadour or some creamy cheese. Oh my gosh. Oh my goodness, so good.
Oh man, that sounds good.
Well, what I wanted to talk about a little bit was to go back to péché mignon and the word péché, the cute sin. I cracked up one day when I was at a bakery, and I saw there were these things called paix de nonne.
Mm-hmm.
These little, they're called nun farts.
Yeah.
Nun farts. That's the word for this treat. They're called nun farts. And I thought, are you kidding me? Nun farts. And people just, and they say, oh, it's called a nun fart because I don't know. There's all these like myths behind how that word was, the word was coined. But paix de nonne, nun farts. And then there's also la religieuse, une religieuse. The 3-layer, it's like one of the most indulgent pastries you can find.
You like choux pastry, I can tell. It's all like that same kind of puff of pastry filled with pastry cream and stacked on top of each other so that they look like a fat little nun in its habit. So that religious connotation comes back for sure.
But what's interesting is if you look at like Italian or Spanish, like, the cousins of France, when you're talking about a péché mignon or a guilty pleasure, France has a longer history of critiquing the church and joking, making kind of being more risque and pushing the boundaries. Whereas in Italy and Spain, you wouldn't find that kind of word. People wouldn't say, oh, it's my cute little sin. Look at me eating this. You wouldn't put the word sin in there because that would be more controversial. But in France, people just say, oh, it's my cute sin. Look at me. No problem.
And I wonder how much of that acceptability of using the word sin and just kind of being blasé about it in France has to do with how long, France has been laïque, has been secular, and the fact that, for as much as there is definitely a dominant Catholic history here, I think most people feel pretty far away from, if they do have a Christian background, they feel pretty far away from it culturally here, which is not necessarily true in those other countries that you mentioned, or even really in the US.
Yeah, exactly. It would actually be offensive to a much larger segment of the population. Whereas in France, it's completely, normal. Péché mignon.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, 2 important questions. 1 is, where can people find you? And 2 is, where can people find these fantastic chouquettes that you found?
The fantastic chouquette, it's this little bakery, Ile Saint-Louis, called Au Petit Cake.
Okay.
And I did a little comedy video there. They let me stand behind the counter and do a video there recently, so that was funny. And it was actually on the pronouncing chouquette and pain au chocolat and croissant, because my American character went in and butchered the pronunciation. And then the French character, who I play both of them, the French character, put him in his place and made sure he left pronouncing the pastries correctly, or the viennoiserie, how should I say. And people can find me on Instagram. Alex Teaches French on Instagram. I'm also on TikTok because, it's 2022. So we're on TikTok now, TikTok and YouTube, but I'm primarily on Instagram.
Great. And we will put links to all of those in our show notes, as well as a link to your video, your comedy video, making sure that you pronounce all of your viennoiserie and pastry or whatever your péché mignon is correctly. Thank you so much for helping us do that. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
C'est de la gourmandise. Merci beaucoup.
Merci. Bye. This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.